Welcome back to Face the Nation. Earlier, we sat down with President George W. Bush's Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. She now teaches at Stanford University and is the co-author of a new book, To Build a Better World, Choices to End the Cold War and Create a Global Commonwealth. President Trump represents a very different kind of foreign policy for the Republican Party. It's more isolationist than Republicans like yourself have been in the past. Do you think that's more reflective of where the party is now?
I don't know where the party is, but I certainly believe that President Trump is speaking to something that's in the country. If you think back to the interview that President Barack Obama did with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic just before he left office, there are really a lot of echoes of what you hear with President Trump. He talked about allies being kind of free riders. There was a sort of anger and frustration sounding through about allies and what they do. And so this has been coming for some time, probably a little bit of exhaustion with the wars and terrorism and vigilance. But the fact is, the American people have kind of two impulses simultaneously. One is, we're tired of those burdens of leadership. Can't somebody else do it? You hear that echoed by President Trump and earlier by President Obama. But they also don't want to see Syrian babies choking on nerve gas. They don't want to see people beheaded on TV, as ISIS was doing. They don't want to see Vladimir Putin laying waste to his neighbors, or Venezuelans starving because they have a bad government. And so what the president has to do is to activate the part of America that wants to continue to lead. And sometimes I think you get that from this administration.
Is there an identity that defines Republican foreign policy now?
I don't know if there's an identity that defines foreign policy in either party. The United States is going through a transformative period in which we are leaving one era, the era in which the United States emerged really the sole superpower after the end of the Cold War. Then there was a period of having to deal with terrorism and the attacks that we had the anniversary of on September 11th. Now we're facing all of these new challenges. What do you do about cybersecurity? What do you do about ungoverned spaces where terrorists train, but where you can't go in directly? What do you do about the rise of great powers like China? What do you do about the efforts of a declining power like Russia to disrupt the international system? The problems are different, and I think we're going to have to come to a new consensus about what really principles are going to guide American foreign policy. I hope that there will be some echoes of the old principles, that America is going to be involved, that without the United States, the world is a more chaotic place. I hope that those principles will involve patience.
In the book, To Build a Better World, you say you wrote it because you think the world is drifting towards another systemic crisis. Is this a warning?
I hope it's a bit of a wake-up call. When we see the rise of what we've called the four horsemen of the apocalypse, populism, that says, don't believe in those institutions, you go around them directly to the people. Well, there's some dangers in that. When you see the rise of what I'll call nativism, I think saying it's nationalism, for Americans, nationalism is not a bad thing. It's not bad to be proud of, patriotic toward your country. Nativism, though, pits you against them. When you see isolationism, when you see protectionism growing, the whole idea that the international economy is better if people trade, if countries trade freely, when you see that under attack, I do think we're drifting toward a systemic crisis.
But those four things you just outlined sound a lot like what defines Trumpism.
But it's not just what defines some of the president's policies, America First, for instance. It defines a lot of what you're hearing across the world. It defines what you're hearing in Great Britain with Brexit. It defines what you hear from the five-star movement in Italy. It defines what you hear in Brazil with Bolsonaro. So the question is, why are we getting this response? And elites can't sit back and say, oh, you're just wrong. Mm-hmm. There has to be some self-evaluation of how late-stage capitalism is dealing with some of the new challenges.
Do you think Republicans are doing enough to push back against those 4 horsemen?
Well, I do think that you see people pushing back on very specific circumstances. Now, let's be fair. When it comes to some foreign policy issues that I was dealing with a decade ago, you have to give the administration credit for having taken them on. North Korea. Nobody's been able to solve the North Korean problem. I don't have a problem with how they're going about that. I would say that on Iran, they're pushing back correctly on an Iranian regime that is the most dangerous and disruptive regime in the Middle East.
Should President Trump meet with President Rouhani?
I have no problem with negotiating with the Iranians, but you have to do it when the conditions are right. When you have a negotiation that looks like the Taliban is not going to even recognize the legitimate democratically elected government of Afghanistan, not going to recognize the Constitution, now you have to step back and say, is this time really to negotiate? When you're negotiating from a position of strength, as I think we would be with the Iranians or with the North Koreans, because the sanctions have weakened those economies, that's fine. When your partner or your adversary thinks that they have the upper hand, which I think the Taliban thinks, because they think we want to get out so badly, we'll take anything, then I think you have to stop and say, this may not be the time to negotiate.
Do you think that the president needs to be taking more care on those issues when he discusses race and when he discusses immigrants?
I do, and I've said, I think that particularly from the White House, you need language that recognizes how raw race is as a factor in America. I grew up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama. All right, I understand race and racism and the like. But I'm going to tell you, Margaret, I think that we could all be better in the way that we deal with this very raw nerve, which is race. I think it's time to stop labeling each other and using explosive terms like she's a racist, he's a racist. That stops the conversation. Right? When you say that, that's meant to stop the conversation. And we need to have a conversation. We also need to, and I say this very often to my students, identity is a wonderful and marvelous thing. I am tremendously proud of my ancestors who survived the horrors of slavery, came out of it, and by the time of my grandfather were being college educated. I'm tremendously proud of that legacy. But I also know that identity has to be something that you don't use against others. And so to the degree that we are breaking ourselves into ever smaller groups with ever larger senses of grievance and ever different narratives, I don't think anybody is doing very well at helping us to navigate this extraordinarily difficult minefield of race.
Our full conversation with Secretary Rice is on our website, facethenation.com. We'll be right back with another former diplomat, President Obama's United Nations Ambassador, Samantha Power. We're back now with former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power. She has a new memoir out. It's called The Education of an Idealist. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
Does being an idealist survive working in the White House?
Definitely, but you do have to learn how to prosecute your ideals. So the story I tell is not one of going in naive about how easy it will be to promote human rights from Washington, but I went in knowing it'd be hard, and then learned how to build coalitions, learned how to work with other countries to fight things like the Ebola epidemic or get political prisoners out of jail. But you do have to keep learning and be self-critical as you go, and that's the story I tell.
Secretary Rice, you heard her just there lay out a number of things she said were very similar between President Trump and President Obama in terms of responding to this strong reaction against military intervention, this idea that the system needs to be completely changed and that allies aren't shouldering more of the burden. Do you see those same similarities?
We could not be more different. In fact, it's true that in the wake of the disastrous invasion of Iraq and the overstretch and the militarization of our foreign policy after 9/11 generally, that there is a fatigue in the country. That part I agree with. But there's a major difference between the current approach of attacking our democratic institutions at home, undermining our ability to lead internationally, attacking our allies, cozying up to abusive regimes, alienating everybody. So if you need them in the face of a crisis, it's going to be very hard to pick up the phone and actually get people to come into your coalitions. A big difference between that, which is the present, and what we did, which was strengthen our alliances. Yes, call on allies to do more. The United States can't can't shoulder the burden alone. Absolutely, that is the case. But you can do so in a manner that still preserves the relationships, deepens the relationships, and ensures that when you go and try to end Iran's nuclear program, you get not only the European allies at the table with you, but also Russia and China for all of the difficulties there. When you go and try to broker an agreement to curb climate change, you go first to China and are actually able to forge that agreement, and then you take it global and bring other countries on board. And you're able to build a 78-nation coalition to defeat ISIS, which is something that President Trump has carried through. But he couldn't build that coalition today. There's no way after the reckless foreign policy that's been pursued.
You built your career, you won a Pulitzer Prize, around talking about human rights law, in particular genocide. And you're clear in your book that you morally had some problems with President... And strategically, but with President Obama's decision not to strike Syria in the wake of those devastating chemical weapons attacks. General Mattis called that the shot not heard around the world. Why didn't you resign?
Well, first of all, in the book, what I try to do is bring readers into the Situation Room so they see just the complexity of decisions like that one. And when you are in the Situation Room and you're looking at the deaths of 1,400 people and you're seeing refugee flows out of Syria that have the capacity, as they would go on to do, to destabilize countries, not just Syria itself, you see 500,000 lives ultimately taken in Syria. There are a whole set of imperatives that grow out of that. At the same time, the U.S. Congress would not support President Obama when he went to them and said, hey, let's do this together. Let's make sure that Assad can't wait us out and just start gassing again, and then we're in a position where we're divided domestically. So our foreign policy is going to be stronger if we can heal some of these divisions at home. And without that kind of base for acting internationally, especially when it comes to use of military force, I think President Obama, again, I happen to take a different position, but ultimately it is very hard to be a leader when the rug is being pulled out from you, particularly by the opposition party.
But Assad has now essentially won that war.
He has absolutely consolidated control over territory, but it's not the case necessarily when you ask why I didn't resign, and I go into that at length in the book because a lot of people asked me that at the time.
I mean, people ask that question now about the Trump administration. On matters of principle, why continue to serve and not resign if you object?
Well, again, I would draw distinctions between locking children up in cages and so forth and making, I think, a reasonable decision that U.S. military force alone would not have brought the war to an end. I thought perhaps in the wake of the gas attack, we could catalyze diplomacy. It was a limited strike of the kind that I thought would not lead to entanglement. President Obama agreed. He was pursuing military force. And again, Congress did not support him in that regard, reflecting, I think, the larger skepticism among the American people. But what I show in the book is how much good you can do from these jobs. And I was really fortunate to be a member of the President's cabinet, to be able to launch a campaign to get female political prisoners out of jail and to actually succeed in getting them out of jail, to be able to build a coalition with President Obama and Secretary Kerry to end the Ebola epidemic in West Africa when people had predicted that more than 1 million people would die. So we are divided, as Secretary Rice indicated. The reason I chose to tell a very personal story was to open up just how meaningful this work can be and to show, again, the complexity of decisions and to show that not everything is as binary and I guess the sort of gotcha politics that we have today, that there are good flesh and blood people inside government, inside our public institutions generally, who are trying to make the world better and who do in fact succeed.
You helped shepherd through the Paris Climate Change Accord, which now every Democrat running for president says they're going to rejoin. But you also say that's not sufficient to meet the level of threat right now. So what else needs to happen?
Well, first and foremost, we have to meet the commitments that we made in the Paris Agreement. I mean, one of the things President Obama did was had us bring the Paris Agreement into law, international law, quicker than any international climate or environmental agreement ever, worried that in case the November 2016 election went a different way, then the agreement itself would collapse. So the agreement still exists globally. but the commitments we made were a floor, and everybody was very clear on that. So we've got to get into it, meet our commitments, and then be much more ambitious in terms of what we do domestically and critically, and this is why U.S. leadership is so catalytically important. We leverage the commitments we make, the sacrifices we make to get other countries to do far more. That's how the global system works when it does.
Ambassador, it's a personal memoir. You talk a lot about being a working woman and the challenges of being pregnant and juggling all that at the same time.
To
it's
which
a
you
good
can
read.
relate.
It was a good read.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We'll be back in a moment with a look at how Americans view climate change.
From CBS Washington, in color, Face the Nation, a spontaneous and unrehearsed news interview.
Senator Nelson, Congressman McCloskey, next Wednesday is Earth Day.
What are people going to do, though, when they find out that this cleaning up of the environment might involve less use of automobiles by them?
Within 25 years, most major metropolitan areas in America, if we don't stop it, you will not be able to stay outdoors more than 2 or 3 hours without a serious health hazard. You'll have to go out, your kids will go outdoors and play in gas masks.
That was the very first time we had an extended conversation about the environment on Face the Nation. And that dire prediction of children having to wear gas masks while playing outside did not come true. But almost 50 years later, more than 6 in 10 Americans see climate change as a crisis or serious problem, and more than half say we need to act now. Our CBS News poll out today also shows that just 1 in 10 Americans say human activity does not contribute at all to climate change. This week, CBS News, along with more than 250 news outlets worldwide, is participating in covering the Climate Now project. We'll be looking at the challenges and the political discord on what causes climate change and how we can fix it. Our poll also shows that 2 in 3 Americans trust their meteorologists for information about climate change. So who better to kick off this special series than CBS's own climate and weather contributor, Jeff Berardelli. Jeff, good to have you here.
Good to be here.
So part of the political argument around climate change is whether or not man plays a role in it. What does the science tell us?
Yeah, so unequivocally, the science believes that it's caused by human beings, by our burning of fossil fuels and our release of these heat-trapping greenhouse gases. 97+% of scientists, there is a consensus, agree that it's caused by humans. These are the scientists that study it day in, day out. It's actually probably closer to around 99% or so. The last 5 years have been the hottest on Earth. It is the warmest it's been in modern human history, maybe even going back tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, we are a force of nature. There are 7.6 billion people on this Earth right now, and obviously things are changing pretty quickly because of that.
And the argument, you have heard even members of the Trump administration say the climate is not definitive. What you're laying out is a very different description. And in our polling, we're seeing that Americans are willing to do things that they think will help the environment, recycle, use energy efficient light bulbs, plastic bags at stores. Do those things make a dent in the problem you're describing?
So each individual thing we do doesn't, but if we have conversations and society starts to become more sustainable, kind of a grassroots thing where, you know, the low-hanging fruit, you only have to do the little things, and those lead to better habits and kind of rub off on the people around you, your family, your friends. Have the conversations, and that starts a grassroots movement from the bottom. At the same time, we need it to come from the top as well. So yes, it does make a difference, not the individual, let's say, plastic bottle that we're not using, but not using a plastic bottle hopefully leads to better habits in your life and in the lives of people around you. We need to become more sustainable with this Earth.
We have seen some really powerful storms and hurricanes. Are those driven by what you're describing with the climate changes?
Yeah, so absolutely, that's part of it. So first of all, ocean heat content has been rising and sets records every single year. About 93% of the excess heat that's trapped by greenhouse gases gets stored in our ocean. Thankfully, otherwise we'd be burning up right now. The problem is all that builds up in the ocean and comes back as extreme weather. So first of all, we have hurricane cycles that are natural, and right now we think we're in a natural uptick. These cycles last around 20 to 30 years. in the Atlantic basin. However, on top of that, we've warmed the Earth by around 1 degree Celsius, about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's research out there that shows that for every 1 degree of global warming, we see a disproportionate number of Cat 4s and Cat 5s. It increases by 25 to 30% the number of Cat 4s and Cat 5s. We see it with storms like Irma and Dorian, which just demolished the Bahamas. And here's the craziest part of this. Compare a storm with winds of 185 miles an hour to a storm with winds of 75 miles an hour. You might think to yourself, okay, twice as much damage, 3 times as much damage, 4 times as much damage. No, it's 1,300 times the damage potential for a storm with winds of 185 like Dorian or a low-end hurricane. That's why just an increase in 20 or 30 miles an hour because of climate change makes a world of difference in terms of damage.
So when we talk about solutions to this, the Paris Climate Change Accord that the Obama administration joined, the Trump administration says it's pulling out of, it locked in or tried to lock in temperature rises at just, 2 degrees Celsius. That you heard from Ambassador Power say that's not enough yet.
It's
but
true.
It's something.
Right.
So
exactly.
Why does 2 degrees make that much of a difference?
Okay, so 2 degrees Celsius is close to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. It's actually about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So think about this. You know, it doesn't sound like a lot. A couple of degrees doesn't sound like a lot. But let's say that your body temperature goes up by 3 or 4 degrees. The Earth system is just as sensitive as your body. If your body goes up from 99 to 103 degrees, your bodily functions begin to break down. Same thing in the Earth. Same thing in the Earth. Everything's very sensitive, everything's very interconnected, and things begin to break down. That's what we're concerned about.
What's the impact on the economy?
It's a huge impact, especially as we head decades forward. Right now, we're already seeing a lot more billion-dollar disasters, so it's already impacting us. But think about this. If the seas rise 2, 3, 4 feet, look at all the trillions of dollars of real estate is in the way of that. It's going to desertify, climate change will desertify large areas of productive agriculture. So people won't be able to make a living anymore. They will migrate. It forces international migration. Picture the time when instead of 10,000 people kind of knocking at your door, we have 100,000 people knocking at our door. It causes international instability. What I would say is there are things we can do. Renewable energy is something everybody agrees on, Republicans and Democrats, and so we should move forward fast.
Thank you for connecting all those dots for us.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And next week, we will talk with former Secretary of State John Kerry. He negotiated that Paris Climate Change Accord in the Obama administration. That's next Sunday on Face the Nation. We'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. But before we go, we want to thank the Jones Day Law Firm and everyone behind the scenes at Face the Nation. They've been working nonstop getting us moved in up here. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.